Frequency, podcasts that resonate.
For more than a year now, Canada has been grappling with immigration.
And I feel sorry for these people, the asylum seekers and the refugees. They want to work, but guess what? They're costing the taxpayers of Ontario $1 billion.
I think that right now, the top priority in discussions between Quebec and the federal government is to reduce the number of temporary immigrants.
Plan this year gives a better snapshot for people to look at total population growth and the growth of temporary residents, as well as the measures that we're putting into place to reduce those populations over the next few years.
Stabilize our population growth to give all levels of government time to catch up. Time to make the necessary investments in healthcare, in housing, in social services to accommodate more people in the future.
After decades of consensus on immigration, today more Canadians than ever feel there is too much immigration to Canada. Consecutive years of working to increase immigration levels have led to record population growth. But the Trudeau government has now reversed course and cut Canada's official immigration target by 20%. According to economists, that change will mean Canada's population will actually shrink over the next year for the first time ever. According to public opinion research, most Canadians think that's a good thing, because record population growth has made the housing and affordability crisis worse. But is that the whole story? What if I told you that as Canada has accepted more newcomers than ever in recent years, immigrants have also been leaving the country at a record pace? What's going on here? I'm David Smith. This is The Big Story. First, they capped student visas for international students. Then they reversed changes to the temporary foreign worker stream, so fewer people can move to Canada to work on temporary visas. And most recently, the Trudeau government took the most drastic step of all and slashed Canada's permanent immigration target by 20%, from 500,000 in 2024 to 395,000 in 2025. To understand why they made these changes, we need to rewind the clock. Between 2023 and 2024, Canada's population grew by more than 1 million people in less than a year. The government now admits that was too many people too quickly. But these new reduced targets only impact future immigration. What about immigrants who are already here? New research shows that they have been leaving Canada in record numbers. What's more concerning, the people leaving are the same high-skilled workers that Canada urgently needs. The people we've been working so hard to attract are now moving to other countries in search of better opportunities. And that's a big problem for the economy. Daniel Bernhard is the CEO of the Institute for Canadian Citizenship. Thanks for joining me.
It's a pleasure.
So your report is called The Leaky Bucket, and it takes a look at what's called onward migration. I'd like to start there. What is onward migration?
It's a great question. It's a fundamental concept here, and it's worth exploring. So onward migration is the egghead term for immigrants leaving Canada. But specifically, we're talking about people who have obtained permanent resident status. So not temporary workers or students or anything like that. We're talking about people who have the ability to stay in the country permanently, but are choosing not to. And we are able to now track it, thanks to the beauty of Statistics Canada, across a number of different dimensions, how long people have been in Canada, their category of entry, et cetera. But basically, we're talking about immigrants who've come to Canada and at some time or another said thanks, but no thanks, and moved on.
So I'm going to quote from your report here. Quote, "These are not desperate people fleeing destitution for the comfort of Canada's generosity. Rather, they are a globally coveted talent pool with global options. When we fail to retain newcomers, we are essentially helping them to contribute to another country's success." End quote. That seems counterintuitive. So who are these people who are increasingly abandoning Canada for better opportunities elsewhere?
Well, let's first talk about who's coming to Canada in general, because I think that will set the stage really appropriately. Over 60% of immigrants to Canada are in the economic class, which means that they are hand-selected for their ability to address some of Canada's most pressing needs, whether that's in construction, trades, healthcare, early childhood education, maintaining Canada's sort of bilingual balance, and a number of other priority areas. So when my parents came to Canada, they spoke relatively little English. They had no education. They were quite young. They would never be admitted today. Today, in the point system that governs most immigration in Canada, we're rejecting 96% of the applicants. You have to be in the top 4 percentile to be admitted here. And so who are we getting today? We're getting people who speak English and French, sometimes both impeccably well. People with very advanced degrees, master's degree is highly, highly common. A lot of advanced professional experience, et cetera, et cetera. So that's who's coming to the country. They're coming to address specific needs, and they're coming with exceptional qualifications, but it also means that they're coming with plenty of options, not only in their host societies where they had, often advantageous positions, but also in other countries. And so instead of thinking of immigration as just a manifestation of Canada's generosity, where we're welcoming people who are fleeing hardship, which we still do, and it's a good thing that we do, and they're important contributors to our society. The vast majority of people coming as immigrants are economic immigrants who have other choices. And if we're not able to convince them that the decision to move to Canada was the right decision, they can and will explore options elsewhere.
And what kind of skills do these people have? Who are the workers that we're trying to attract to Canada right now?
Well, we have really evident needs. In early childhood education, for example, there is a daycare where my son attends now that has an empty room in it because they don't have anyone that they can find to work there. This is a unionized place with benefits that pay over $30 an hour, and they're still short-staffed. That's, a half dozen mothers who can't get back into the workforce. That's a real need for Canada. Just this week, we invited over 3,000 people with healthcare expertise to become permanent residents to the country. So we are being very highly selective here. And, I know there's a lot of skepticism around immigration in Canada right now, and a lot of people are worried whether the levels of immigration are too high. I understand these worries, and it's a reasonable discussion to have. But we need to see the whole picture. It's not just how many come, but how many stay. And we need to also recognize that immigrants are not just here passively consuming stuff, but consuming housing, consuming healthcare. As I mentioned, in the case of these people who are coming with healthcare skills, they are producing healthcare, and immigrants are much more likely than the general population to work in the healthcare field. So if you were to take, 10% of the immigrant population out of the country, yeah, you might take 10% of the people out of the hospital waiting room, but you'd probably take 30 or 40% of the people out of the hospital staff room. And that side of the equation is not being discussed enough. This is a ledger with two sides to it. And we need to recognize that immigrants are contributing immensely to our economy. They're not just here to take, not just here as a manifestation of our generosity, but as a reflection of our real need. And they are also in need elsewhere. And what this study is showing is that if Canada can't deliver a winning experience, especially in the crucial early years after they arrive, that many people would do what you and I would do if they were unsatisfied with the decision they'd make. They'd try and go somewhere else, whether that's back to their home country or a third country. So it's all of Canada that's losing here when these people are leaving.
A ledger with two sides. I'm glad you framed it that way. That's really interesting. I want to drill down on that a little bit. The narrative in Canada right now, which the federal government itself is now pushing, is that we added too many people too quickly. That was a mistake, and we need to reverse that. They have aggressively cut the permanent resident target by 20%, from 500,000 to 395,000. But at the same time, they're not talking about these onward migration numbers. They're not talking at all about the people who have already settled here who are now choosing to leave. Is that a concern for you?
Look, we live in a democracy, which means that sometimes public opinion becomes public policy, and the government is responding to dramatic changes in public sentiment that are happening in Canada, where Canadians are saying they feel there's too much immigration happening. And at a superficial level, I understand this. If you've been waiting for months and months for a procedure or to see a specialist, it makes sense to wonder if adding more people to the system will just make your wait even harder and your condition even more excruciating. But again, as I said earlier, we need to move past that superficial understanding to understand that actually the specialist or the technician or the person you're willing to see is more likely than not actually be an immigrant, and that their arrival may hasten the experience for all of us. I think the point, though, is that a lot of these issues in healthcare and housing, etc., these are not caused by the population size or by immigration. If you've lived in Canada, for 30, 40 years, you've been talking about housing problems your entire life. You've been talking about healthcare problems your entire life. I'm from Ontario, revealing my age here. I was a kid when Mike Harris was a premier, and healthcare was supposedly, in ruins. That was, many, many generations ago, before immigration levels reach their current state. So if we have concerns about the healthcare system, if we have concerns about housing, let's fix the healthcare system. Let's fix housing. Because actually what's happening is unaffordable housing is the number one reason why skilled immigrants are telling us they're leaving the country. And the debate now is, do we have enough houses for all the immigrants who want to come to the country? I would actually ask, do we have enough houses for all the immigrants that we need to bring into the country to deal with our aging population, to deal with the huge boom in retirements that are happening now in the construction industry in particular? We just announced, as you said, in the government just announced reductions in the overall level of immigrants to say that this will alleviate housing shortages. 2 weeks later, CMHC says housing starts in Ontario have plummeted to new lows. So we're going to be back where we started. The point is that there are many, many factors influencing the housing costs, housing prices. You've explored some of them on your show. The population is just one aspect. And to just focus on the population size, this is like saying, I have a house and there's, holes in the floor and it's really, really dangerous, but everything's fine. Let's just not walk there. No, we have to fix the floor. Let's not distract our attention and pretend that walking on it is actually the problem.
Okay, I'd like to ask you a little bit about the current immigration policy that we do have. Prime Minister Trudeau released a 7-minute long video this week explaining the changes to the immigration policy. 7 minutes long video, very in depth. I can't help but notice, though, in those 7 minutes, the Prime Minister doesn't mention onward migration or skilled worker retention once. So does the federal government track this stuff? Are they working to retain the kinds of immigrants that we need to fill these holes in the workforce? Are we keeping a ledger of how many people are leaving Canada after they settle here? What's the status of that?
Federal government does not track onward migration. And actually, this whole study started, I entered this job at the Institute for Canadian Citizenship. We are, just by the way, an independent national charity that aspires to a Canada where immigrants don't just come, but stay and contribute meaningfully to our shared success. We were talking for a while about how many immigrants are coming to the country. And I said, okay, that's great, but how many are staying? What's our churn? What's our retention rate? And actually nobody knew. And so we had to go out and do this study on our own with the support of the Conference Board of Canada, and using data provided by Statistics Canada, we're able to paint this picture now. One of the things that we're calling for is for the government to adopt these retention targets that they can publicly report against, so that Canada and the Federal Public Service can have a better sense of the full picture. I would just say, though, that in the grand scheme of things, at least for now, it's not like we're losing, double-digit percentages every year. But the trend is going up, and it has been going up for 30 years. And in the most recent years, it's spiked considerably above the averages. So we're not yet in danger territory where nobody wants to come to Canada and we can't find people to come. Of course, anyone who's just taken even a cursory look at the news understands that's not yet the case. But the trend is really worrisome. And the data are lagging. So we are now looking at data for 2020 and 2021, which are the most recent years that we can have available to us. But of course, I think today we'd all hazard a guess, and we'll probably be proven right, that it's going to be much, much worse once the data for 2024 come out. So we need to get onto this, and we need to get over ourselves and realize that it's not just, like as you said, it's not just people fleeing destitution who are coming here for whom everything is upside because, Canada's great. These are people with global experience and global options. And if increasingly we're failing to retain them, that's a troublesome sign. So we're not in danger territory yet. It's not on fire. Canada still remains a good place for immigrants to come, and has really a lot of advantages when it comes to attracting and retaining immigrants. But those are slipping, and we ought to pay close attention to them and make sure that we arrest this trend before it becomes a real threat to our prosperity.
Yeah. I want to highlight a specific example from the report of how Canada's targeted immigration policies may be failing, or at least coming up short. We have something called the Atlantic Immigration Program. The federal government has a whole program to attract immigrants to the Atlantic region, but the report here says the Atlantic provinces have the highest rate of immigrants leaving. It says 30% of immigrants accepted to Atlantic Canada next year are projected to leave. Is that right?
Yeah, over the long term, that's correct.
Right.
But even in the short term, the Atlantic provinces have the dubious distinction of having the people who leave those provinces leave really fast too. So they have many more people who are leaving in the first 5 years, and actually then longer term, the retention rates are okay. I think what this does is it speaks to the real diversity that exists in our country. I'm not talking about ethnic diversity in this case. I mean the diversity of regions and economies and contexts. In Atlantic Canada, most of the people who leave from smaller centers. In Ontario, most of the people who leave from bigger cities. So it's a big country. And while we need to have unity and consistency in the urgency of our response and the concertedness of our response to really address this phenomenon and reverse it, hopefully, we also need to have a lot of variation, flexibility, and local sensibility applied to how we do that response, because the circumstances really are very, very different across the country. I mean, even with Francophones as another population that we talk about. So 20% of immigrants are projected to leave the country in the long term, but it's 35% among Francophones, right? It's a huge delta. Having said that, Francophones inside Quebec and Francophones outside Quebec have very, very different experiences. So the diversity of this country is immense, and we need to take it into account when we're looking at retention. One size really doesn't fit all.
Yeah, that's another interesting stat on the Francophone side of things. Canada has French as an official language, and yet we're losing a high percentage of our Francophone immigrants after they've settled. So in closing, what are your key recommendations for the government on this file? If you were advising the Immigration Minister, Mark Miller, what would be your top 3 or 4 points that you want him to take a look at?
Well, if I was advising Minister Miller, the first thing I would advise him to do is find a better advisor. But having said all that, we're making 3 recommendations predominantly here for this report. The first one is we think it would make sense for the federal government to adopt immigrant retention targets. Every year, the federal minister of immigration has to go in front of Parliament and talk about how many people will be coming into the country. And that seems like a great opportunity to also talk about how many people we aspire to retain and how we're performing against that goal. It's really difficult to mobilize the public service, or anyone really, to do something of consequence without a goal and a mandate. And this would be, I think, a really good opportunity for us to just start tracking it and then begin to deploy strategies accordingly. Second, we think that there's an opportunity to really broaden Canada's understanding of what settlement services constitute. We have a lot of services in this country, which are language services, career support services, these kinds of things to help immigrants integrate into society. And I think they're fairly high quality services for the most part. But 60% of immigrants to Canada are economic immigrants who've already proven they can speak English and French as a precondition of coming in, for example. They don't need those services, and they're not really using them. Our service mentality is that some people need to be fixed. They have shortcomings. We can address those shortcomings so that they can succeed. We need to broaden that conception to think about people who don't need any fixing, but that we need to convince them that Canada is their forever home. There's a 3 to 7 year window in which the risk to leaving is highest. If we can make those early years winning years, that's really for the benefit of all of Canada. And so we should think about more than just people in need, but the people we need to have a positive experience. And finally, I think, Canadians, we all have a role to play in this. That's a real cliche, but I'm really serious here. It's not just about what the government does. Think about what makes your quality of life, what makes your life worth living in your community. Is it government policy? Yeah, to some extent. but it's also what we do as employers, as colleagues, as neighbors, as people waiting for hot chocolate at the rink while our kids are playing, or, on the sidelines while they're playing soccer. Immigrants are hand-selected for their ability to address Canada's most pressing needs. And when they leave, we lose. And all of us have the ability to make their experience positive here. I think Canadians have a welcoming heart, but we need to understand that immigrants, in many cases, we need them more than they need us. Circumstances have changed dramatically over the last 30, 40 years as to who is coming. We now have much more elite people coming with many more options, and the onus is on us, if we would like to benefit from their contributions, to make sure it's worth their while. And we're not talking about people being disloyal or unreasonable. We're simply talking about people who are doing what you and I do, just try and make the best choice for their family. And all of us as Canadians have an opportunity to prove that the best choice for their family is to contribute to Canada's success in the long term.
Okay. Daniel Bernhard, thank you for joining me today. Really appreciate your time.
It's a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Daniel Bernhard is the CEO of the Institute for Canadian Citizenship, joining me in Ottawa today. Again, that report is called The Leaky Bucket, done in partnership with the Conference Board of Canada. You can find that online. If you're curious, I would recommend you go check it out. Lots of interesting stuff in there. That's it for The Big Story today. A reminder, again, if you're not listening to The Big Story on the Seeker app, you're really missing out. That's a great new listening experience we have for you. S-E-E-K-R, Seeker app, spelled S-E-E-K-R, Seeker. I'm David Smith. Thank you for listening.